Hello, everyone. Glad you're able to join us for this discussion on parking. My name is Chris Martin. I'm the treasurer of the Urban Design Group, and I'm co-founder and director at Urban Movement, which is an urban design practice founded to investigate these very moments where transport meets urban life. Tonight, we're going to hear from a fantastic range of speakers, and then we can start the conversation, finishing up around 7:30, I think. And to that end, please do get your questions in the chat, so then we can work through these afterwards, and we can start that informal discussion. As usual, we're recording this, so I'm just going to assume you're happy with that. In terms of the running order today, first up, we're going to hear from Amanda Reynolds of AR Urbanism, and she'll be talking about the costs and opportunities of parking. And then after her, we'll hear from Bob White, who's an independent consultant, and he's going to be talking about the work around space to park. Then we're going to be hearing from Paul Sallin of Uttlesford District Council, talking about a local authority perspective. And then we're going to hear from John Little of Bespoke Transport Consulting on parking reduction strategies. From my point of view, and to start the debate tonight, I wanted to run through a few thoughts. So I'll just share that. Just want to run through some thoughts for you and think about where this all came from. And interestingly, I thought the curb-based occupancy in London and London streets rose from about 50% in 1951 to 75% in 1953, as rising car ownership outpaced parking provision. And this mainstream of cars and driving didn't go unnoticed or contested, with one now infamous quote from a resident in St Helens querying whether those parking in his street would buy furniture if they had no house to keep it in. And to highlight the sort of unintended consequences that exist all around parking, with an earlier increase in sort of shiny and expensive status symbols being parked in people's streets, came the positioning of children socializing in streets as more and more menacing. And as the lines sort of between outdoor play and delinquent behavior were really purposely blurred, resulting in the dramatic reduction and indeed criminalization of play in urban streets. And of course, more cars meant less safety for people in streets and an inevitable decline in the social life of residential streets as well. And the 1934 Road Traffic Act subsequently brought significant changes to the landscape of city streets as well because of this, including the introduction of the beloved pedestrian guard railing, further restricting people's movement in streets and starting that slippery slope of vehicle prioritization. And fast forwarding to where car is king, in the US, there are now 8 parking spaces per car across the country, covering up to 30% of US cities. And at the heart of this is the fact that the more parking we have, the more we're able to and the more we're invited to drive. And as such, parking influences how we move about and choose to make journeys, but also, of course, shapes our cities and our landscapes. And clearly connected to this idea is the idea of parking minimums, which I'm sure we're going to be hearing a lot about tonight. And with the suburbanization following the Second World War, sort of off-street parking requirements became popular, and it really forced developers to create a huge supply of parking at little or no direct cost to the towns and cities which were mandating them. It can of course be argued that increasing and mandating for off-street parking has the other unintended consequence of pushing buildings further and further apart, resulting in the need for more and more driving, and in full vicious cycle, more and more parking. And for this very reason, the cities we love, the towns we love, and the places we love to visit in them or live in are not designed around the principles of parking standards and minimums, because at the end of the day, you could argue parking is the death of urban vitality and conviviality. Places that you have to drive to, get out your car before you can relax, places where you can only enjoy being a pedestrian momentarily, they're not a model for successful urban design, it's a model for Disneyland. It's quite clear in my mind that we need to move away from the idea that sort of plentiful and low-cost parking at our doorstep is a key component of economic success. Cities such as Paris and Oslo are leading the way, committing to reduce the amount of city centre parking over the next 5 years, and instead asking residents what they want to use the space for. I think connected to this, and interestingly, we've heard so much about the 15-minute city concept, so I won't dwell on it. But it's aiming to address these ideas and make sort of transport a servant to quality of life. And presenting it in this way, as we have on screen, is something we're really used to in food health. Look at the right-hand hierarchy and you'll recognize that we need to base our diet on things at the bottom, augment with things in the middle, and sparingly use things at the top. And this is directly comparable, I think, with urban development and transport. We need to base our transport system and provide first for the things at the bottom, augment with things in the middle, and sparingly use things from the top. And on the left, we see that applied. And thinking of urban transport and development in this way makes sure that people don't have to think long and hard about the least worst way to get somewhere. It creates more successful and human-centered places, and is also central to creating climate-safe streets, more resilient neighborhoods, and ultimately zero-carbon cities. And I'd like to make this point, but supporting this is a notion that there is no vehicle better adapted to combat urban centres than a bicycle. And conversely, there's no vehicle more poorly adapted than the car. A cyclist who stops riding becomes someone strolling in the city and contributing to city life. A driver who wants to stop driving becomes someone with a serious storage problem. And just to close this out, key to my mind is that streets and space between buildings are simply the building blocks of towns and cities, and what make them inherently social spaces, despite what you might think. Because towns and cities were born out of our collective willingness to coagulate together with a huge group of other people and take the chance on the endless possibilities that a concentration of human imaginations afford. We can picture the cities that have always been laid out following this conviviality principle. Rome and all its piazzas spring to mind, but others are having to work hard and set aside more and more space for citizens to come together. The street, I would argue, is perhaps the most significant public space in the city, mainly because it's right outside your door, and also because streets often make up around 30% of open space in an entire city. So because of this, perhaps the most impactful improvement to society and public life we can make is to give more space to people in city life, as this encourages us to spend more and more time in a public forum, more time in streets, more time in public realm, increasing opportunity for social interaction and for exchange, for spontaneity, and for city life. And this is what towns and cities are for. This is what society needs from them, and this is what makes us happy. So this conviviality principle needs to become more concrete, I think, in our thinking around parking and neighborhood design. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Amanda to get the presentation started. And please do get your comments, your thoughts in the chat, and I look forward to getting into them in a minute.
Hi everybody. Thanks, Chris. Thanks very much for sharing the screen and showing my slides, Jacqueline. Okay, so I'm going to talk about there's very little in this about costs, and certainly nothing about costs and money terms, but there is always a price to pay for anything that we import. So urban transformation opportunities is what I'm looking at in terms of car parking. Next slide. And that, I mean, I'm sure everybody's seen this Notre Dame one, but this was considered clearly not a serious conversion for Notre Dame. Next slide.
Sorry, Amanda, I seem to be having they seem to have jammed.
There's down the bottom right, is that arrow?
So I am going to
go out and come back in again.
I'm going to come back in. I'm so sorry. It's
we've been having gremlins tonight, everybody, in terms of presentations, so there might be a few hiccups as we go.
Right, so
you do.
I'm going to take the risk on. I'm just going to. I know it's got bits on the top, but I think it's jamming. Could you go with this? Would this work for you?
It's fine for me. It's hopefully everybody else can see it and
it looks great. Yeah, let's go with that.
Annoyed about the rest, so that's good. So what we're doing in our practice, looking at we're doing a lot of work on high streets and town centres outside of London, and design and regeneration strategies for those places, and the car is absolutely key to this. So we're taking this approach. We're looking at the 3 R's: reduce, relocate, and restructure. We're trying to reduce overall vehicle use and reduce that through modal shift, getting people to walk more, making places much better for cyclists. And Chris has just shown us some fabulous slides of walking and cycling places. Though, as somebody said in the chat, not everybody can cycle. Disabled people and elderly people have problems with bicycles. So we do need to think about the opportunities for inclusive access for all. The second, and of course in smaller towns and cities, getting public transport upgraded is really important, and that's quite problematic in terms of funding that comes in, etc. So the other steps that we take: relocating parking, at-grade parking to the fringes of towns, and particularly long-term all-day parking. People often come to work, particularly for the local authorities, we find, and park smack in the middle of their town centres, and the car sits there for 7 hours. It's just it's a storage space, as Chris mentioned. So relocating car parks to the fringes and getting people to walk for 7 minutes rather than 1.5, or using park and ride principles as well, and systems. The other thing in larger areas and as part of a phased process is restructuring parking. So phasing parking removals by consolidating a whole lot of at-grade parking into temporary and potentially relocatable multi-story car parks. Now, as of course we're redeveloping these empty sites, the potential demand for car parking can also increase. So we've got to also look at a completely new approach to how we do new development. Now, next slide, please. I shouldn't spend too long on each of one of these. So the context that we're all working in at the moment: struggling town centre retail, end of life cycle for a lot of 20th century shopping centres, lots of dismal high streets, poor bus services in many places, not everywhere, dangerous cycling infrastructure, increasing housing need. This is another aspect of mixed uses in town centres, underperforming evening and cultural economies, and disregarded or underperforming heritage assets. So next slide. So the direction of travel in terms of modes of movement, unfortunately, the growth of the SUV, and I was reading something that says that SUV sales in the last 10 years have completely cancelled out any gains we've made in terms of shifting to electric vehicles. We've got to completely ban the damn things. So the future of mobility includes behaviour and infrastructure changes. Car sharing and renting, modal shift to micromobility, whether that's scooters, cycles, whatever, more micro rental, and of course better public transport, better transit. Next slide. We all need more carrots than sticks. More walkable cities need improved public transport. That's so important. Safer cycle routes, a more and nicer public realm. I want to rehabilitate the word nice. It has a bit of a bad press, but actually we all like nice places and nice things. We do need to adopt higher density development in places where people are maybe not used to it. 2 stories is not a good height for development in any town centre. We need more people to live in town centres, more cultural activities, good adaptive reuse of heritage assets, and more flexible working arrangements with ground floors. A couple of images there. The top one is BBC White City, that wonderful iconic building. This used to be the parking court in the middle. It now looks like a great green square that they've all got. The bottom one is a project we're working on at the moment in Southampton city centre, and what you're looking at there is currently a multi-storey car park. We've proposed the demolition of this for a new development, new public realm, and a new link that doesn't exist through the city. And surprisingly, everybody thinks it's a good idea, apart from the people who have the lease on the car parking building. Next slide, please. So what are the resistors to change? Well, political will is a huge one. And transforming the male, pale and stale councillors and highways officers. I'm terribly sorry to be rude to any highways people who are listening, but we come up against problematic highways people all the time. We need younger and greener councillors, people in power, people who make the decisions, people who sit on planning committees. This is a very general and maybe provocative statement, but I think it would help. The other problem are things like this chap down here on the right, retailers. And all research shows almost inevitably increase in retail turnover if you take the car parks away from out the front of the shop and replace these with trees and more pleasant experiences. However, most retailers will resist this hugely because they believe that if somebody can't park outside their shop, nobody's going to actually come and spend their money. So there's a massive education process needed. Fewer car parks, and of course, as we all know, if living in London, and it's probably happening in the rest of the UK as well, low traffic neighbourhoods have produced enormous fights in various parts of London with the people who want to use their cars and drive them everywhere, kicking up an enormous fuss. And that's indicative of wider issues. Next slide. So a couple of case studies. This is King's Lynn in Norfolk. Next slide. This is all the at-grade and multi-storey car parks around this rather fantastic heritage town. It's not a city. The most enormous amount of space in the most brilliant town. So, and we were commissioned by the council to look at 7 of these sites, 5 of which were actually at-grade car parks, and what could we do with them. Next slide. This is what they look like. The bottom right is a fantastic square called I think that's the Tuesday Market, which does still have a brilliant market. But even on market day, 50% of the square is still dedicated to car parking and truck parking. And as you can see, these other spaces everywhere. Next slide. So looking at one of the car parking spaces, we did a whole lot of phased processes about development, making reducing the area of parking, getting it into the middle, getting rid of all the longer term car parking, building housing which had fewer car parks for the houses, potentially also looking at a multi-storey car park in the middle there. And the final proposal was just to completely develop it with housing and some street-based unallocated parking. That was one of the options, and that had also fronted onto a little commercial street, so bringing in workspace and uses as well. The next slide. And the context of this is, as you can see, heritage, rather wonderful church, and also some very old buildings with very fine grain footprints all the way around, which used to also occupy this at-grade car park. So trying to replace it with something that kind of respected the scale and form and had a whole lot of similar uses. And this was just an image really to show them. So the next slide. And just to finish up on that, this was a couple of years ago, we finished the Kings Lynn project, and the councillors had a huge problem with it. They wanted us to look at redeveloping all the car park sites, but they wanted to re-provide the car parking and to add other car parking for the development there. So we had the most massive difficulty getting them to understand that you really can't do that, and we wouldn't be achieving anything. But we did identify satellite car parking locations just on the edge of the town, which would have been really good for them to start shifting the parking out. As far as I understand it, they've so far done nothing. And Boston, just up the road or up the river, really, around the coast from Kings Lynn, is in a similar situation, and you can just see from this aerial photograph how much car parking there is. The top right-hand corner is the old market square and the fabulous parish church, which they know as the Stump. The next slide.
So 1 minute warning, Amanda.
Oh, right. Okay. Very, very briefly. This is all the at-grade car parking, public, private, etc. Next slide. This is all the cars. Next slide. And the brilliant Stump up there. This was the site identified around here, which had single-storey buildings, retail buildings, and a wonderful pedestrian bridge to the marketplace, the railway station over to the left, and no coherent wayfinding between the two. So we propose the next slide. Quite a lot of moving all the car parking out as much as possible and getting a linear green space in here, which actually linked up between the river and still made a meandering connection to the railway station, but it got everybody a lot closer, brought a whole lot of different uses into the town centre, connected with and supported the existing town centre, plus gave them a really important sort of semi-rambler green space there. And I think the next slide's the last one. Clicking onto that one, so just a visual connection of how this could be developed. I think there might just be one more, and yes, we're back to Notre Dame. So thank you very much.
Amazing. Thanks, Amanda. Very good. A few questions in the chat, but we'll save those for the end if you don't mind, and we'll invite Bob White up next to talk around space for park. You're muted, Bob, Christina.
There we go. Thank you very much. And I'm going to, hopefully you can see, is that right?
All good, Bob. Ready to go?
Yep. Brilliant. Thank you. I'm going to scuttle through this because it's like Dragon's Den. I've got 10 minutes to sell you Space to Park and a survey program that will connect with the people who buy new homes in your area. We will mainly be in the developments that are away from town centres, but in Kent certainly, and on the Isle of Wight certainly, these are the majority of places that are being built. And so we are really looking at the old kind of suburbs. Space to Park. Please do access it if you can, because it's a brilliant piece of work. It came out in 2014, had a parliamentary launch, a lot of research behind it, and it's well worth looking up, both the online version and, if you're lucky enough, the hard copy version. I'd also ask you to consider looking at a survey programme. This one you may or may not identify with, but it's available from me to give you an idea of how local authorities, developers, urban designers can connect with the people who actually buy the houses, the people making their biggest single purchase of their lives often, and what they feel about the things that we've been offering them over the past 20 years or so. Now, here's an example of a development that was probably built late 90s, early 2000s. And another. And another. Excuse, that's me shooting out of a windscreen. Sometimes you have to be ready to cut and run just in case anybody takes exception. Guess the car. Suffice to say that is parked on, or was parked on, the pavement day in, day out, without any apparent use other than maybe at the weekends, blocking the footway to vulnerable road users or street users, and it's a Ferrari. Here again, in the same development, which was a flagship development where quality of design was being put forward, various developments won awards, but they won awards based on professional opinion and not the opinion of those who lived there, because the results of the surveys that I mentioned actually suggested that people weren't too happy with certain aspects. This is the traffic light system for those surveys, which relate to the area where the two developments that I've just shown you are. Red means bad, and the more richer green means very good. And as you can see, you put those together there, and only 3 of the areas, and they happen to be the older areas, are actually showing anything other than a negative view of car parking. Safety is better, and yet clearly there is an appreciation of the attractiveness and friendliness. You may wonder what V4K means. Safety, attractiveness and friendliness were the measures that Kent County Council were using for new homes, and what people deserve to have living in their new homes. And we put in parking so that we could get a realistic idea of what people felt. And here again, the same developments, looking at both the parking rating, what did people think of it? Red means negative, very negative, and whether there were parking problems, which in a way you could say always go hand in hand. There's another indicator there, which is the garages used for parking, of which quite a lot of them weren't, largely because some of them you couldn't even get a car in. Here's another failure of design. This street should have been quite nice to live in, according to those who built it, and people are fairly satisfied with the locality, but you will see there's a maintenance nightmare in the making because people are parking on the street, manoeuvring on it, instead of actually using parking round the back. There weren't too many, it wasn't an under provision of parking there, it was merely where it was and people's preferences for parking away from it. Motorists are very cunning. They'll get a car in anywhere given the chance. And sometimes it's not actually going to do any harm. But you give them a cycle route and they move in. This street wasn't quite complete and there's a major problem because the cycle route is already being used for parking. People preferred that to the parking provision that they had actually been offered there, which were behind those gates and possibly also in parking courts. And here again, another cycle route. Nice, just the right width for a car to park on. And dealing with that after people have moved in isn't easy. So are those quality streets? Are we proud of them? Let's get away from the idea that everything is urban, controllable. These are streets in areas where you wouldn't want to be putting weighting restrictions on. Even the ones that were on the high-end development, there was a suggestion of doing that, but would councillors go through with it if the people objected, even though they're the ones who park on the pavements? Of course, you can always bury car parking and hide it. Just pretend it doesn't exist. You can try and constrain it, which isn't the aim of the current government, as I understand it. It's actually about getting the developments in the right place where maybe you can control parking. Of course, neither do we want to be putting cars on a pedestal, and that's the problem, that we've wanted to hide cars instead of actually designing them into the developments properly as an integral part, because often it's the second most expensive purchase. You can, of course, either retrofit or upfront fit with bollards, if that's what you want to do. I wish I had shares in a bollard company. And in case you think that this is a bit funny, these bollards are deliberately at an angle. They were designed by Wayne Hemingway for a development in Dartford, but that's another story. Basically, when it comes to a realistic approach to how you deal with car parking and the amounts, it's ideological to suggest that if you reduce the amount of parking where you will not have any controls on parking, that you will reduce car ownership. What you can do by siting developments properly is actually discourage car use, reducing the need to travel. And of course, with more electric cars, that will be something where people may decide they're going to use their cars less, but that doesn't mean they're not going to want to own them. And so we don't want to put ideology in the place of practical reality. So the golden rule for design would be the right number of the right spaces in the right places, with related agendas of crime and the fear of crime, safety, health, inclusive access and maintenance. Most of those are covered in the surveys that were done. And there's that Ferrari again. Now, of course, there are solutions. Here's an urban one from Germany, I believe. I think it's real. But as I say, we're looking at places where you wouldn't want to be putting double yellow lines. You wouldn't want draconian measures. You want people to have the cars that they believe that they need, but you want to be providing also the alternatives to travel. I don't believe the government is having a war on the car industry at the moment. Now, these are the least land using spaces when they are parallel with the carriageway. This is actually a spine road that carries buses through a major new development, but there is plenty of place for visitors, the odd resident, and cars can still move in between and the buses running through. This is another one where the cars just off the carriageway edge. There's curtilage parking to the rear, courtyard parking to the right. Another example where angled bays are used. This is slightly more land hungry, but actually you can create an attractive street scene. I'd say all of these parking solutions are ones which are appreciated either neutrally or very positively by the people that we surveyed, as opposed to the ones that people disliked intensely and found to be problematic. And again, waiting for the landscaping to mature, but clean lines, space for parking that has been deliberately designed into the development. Here again, making use of a feature, not completed there, the turfs hadn't been laid, but using a feature that existed on the site and actually grouping parking around it in a way that satisfied the residents very well. And there they have their own private spaces within their houses, but also on-street parking that comes around that mound. And there's a wider view showing that this was a development where there were different approaches in different places, and we'll go through those quickly, those approaches. So, for example, here you've got adjacent parking, waiting again for the landscaping to perk up and give a much greener approach to things. This is in Swanley, so it's quite close to a railway station, and people were appreciative of that particular layout. Same development from a different angle. This development was a social housing development in a rural area, and was one of the highest satisfaction developments from the residents in all respects of the development. And it was also a place where children were playing quite happily on the green, and even to a certain degree in the street. Just going through a development where action had to be taken on parking. This was an old paper mill, not too far from London. A river was opened up through it. It previously went actually underneath the mill and powered it. And squares and other forms of providing the parking were put in. But in this particular case, we knew that if there weren't waiting restrictions, it would have to be, well, it would become a mess. And so actually the developer in that case kept control of the streets, always an option, provided it doesn't then force parking out onto neighbouring streets, and have put in management there. And again, that is appreciated by the residents. Then you can use squares, again, waiting for the trees, where this was in winter, but using a square format. People were very happy here. They've got curtilage parking, on-street parking for visitors, and a sense of place that was much appreciated. This is a much more dense development near Canterbury, but again, the square format was used with the rights of way, the street itself running through quite constrained. I'm afraid no wonky bollards there. Those were the bollards themselves were a preventative measure, but the curbs were of such that I don't think we've ever seen anybody parking on the footways there at all. And good old Poundbury, there's still things to learn from Poundbury. I know people boo and hiss sometimes when they see it, but actually there's a lot to learn from the different phases. And again, this was a square with the route running through it. Then moving off the carriageway into courtyard parking. This is frontage courtyard in a very landscape heavy development. And to be honest, as you drive along that street, you can barely see the cars that are in there. And another development where the courtyard parking was to the front of the dwellings, but very discreet. Unfortunately, this is a weekday when I assume that those who did own cars were out, but there the cars would be largely hidden when the vegetation was in full flow. When you start to do courtyards, rear courtyards, you're talking about 3 or 4 times as much land take. And only if the people are going to use them is that worth the effort of that land take, I feel, because if they're not, you end up with the difficulties on street that you've already seen. The car barns here actually are quite effective with little storage space, but look at the land area that is put over to manoeuvring of cars off the carriageway, probably about 4 times as much, if not more, as would be the case if it was done in curtilage or on street. Again, car barns with utility areas, very neatly done. And courtyard parking in an old isolation hospital workhouse development, again, much appreciated by people. And you can see how the original building lent itself to that particular approach, but also the new build around it, which adopted that principle too. This is where I used to live, and it's interesting that I used to play cricket and football in that street. It was probably about a 7.3 metre road, although actually I guess it was in Imperial when it was built in the 40s or 50s. And it's interesting how 2 lines of parking are along each side and there's a trackway through the middle. I'm not going to say that that's particularly good to look at, but it actually works reasonably well, and contemporary approaches like that with street trees, because don't believe that highway engineers oppose them, they can be persuaded, and I think that's part of the problem. I'm ending up with curtilage parking because it's not particularly popular, but actually the people who own that house have 3 cars, and it's difficult to see how they actually get them onto their site. But that's actually the way in, and with the use of vegetation, trees, everything remains quite discreet. Actually, it looks like the hedges need a bit of a trim there. These are just some sketches that indicate basic curtilage parking or on-street parking or a balance of both, showing they don't have to be land hungry. Garages are not a reliable form of parking unless you have waiting restrictions and they are the right size, but they can be incorporated into a design. They often end up as storage, bike store, motorbike store. So that's one option with a conventional street. Those figures aren't set in stone, I should add. Neither would the design be as quite as rigid. But if you're going to adopt a shared space approach, then it can be done even more modestly with an approach like that. And so we're going from the fact that we've so often had the negative views of residents saying how poor their developments are for parking and how this impacts upon safety, especially as regards their children wanting to play in the street. And yet where the parking is delivered in the right way, you find that children can play in the street, and those are places where people meet, they socialise, and there's opportunities there for everybody to work together to actually get parking as part of the design. So coming back to the thing, if we want quality streets, we can design parking into those streets if we're willing to actually take an approach that doesn't ideologically push them out, because unless there's going to be control mechanisms or they're in the right place, which many developments still aren't, then cars are here to stay, and we need to actually accommodate them in a positive way that contributes to the design.
Thanks, Bob. That's brilliant. I think, judging by the chat, people found the sort of real-world examples very useful there. So thank you for that, and look forward to discussing more. Paul, can I pass the mic over to you? Paul from Uttlesford District Council is going to give us a local authority perspective.
Hi there, can everyone see the screen?
Yeah, looking good.
Great stuff. I'm actually from Thurrock Council, just to clarify. I head up a small team of designers. So I'll be taking you through, it's mainly from a sort of development management insight. So it's at the coalface when you're viewing lots of applications, so you get to know lots of issues, and it tends to be all revolves around parking. So quite often you feel more like a parking officer than an urban designer. So it tends to become a bit of a conundrum. I don't know if people remember the Numbers detective show from the 1980s, but it was a ridiculous premise where the main character solved all the crimes through mathematics. And it feels like that as an urban designer, if you can solve the parking conundrum, you can get good design as well. But I think one key message for consultants especially, and officers as well as like myself, is policy is key. Otherwise, these visions, I've done working in private practice and in public practice, you do the master plans, but unless you've got the parking policies in place, some of these nice dreams don't become realities, unfortunately. So you tend to find in most local authorities that there's a parking vicious circle. You've got excessive amounts of parking and poorly integrated parking quite often. And this leads to, I think the quote was about 50% of land take is parking and roads, which is sprawl essentially. You get the place erosion, it's car dominated, and that leads to less walkability. The less walkability, the more you get more car use, more car-based developments, and ultimately ends up with more car parking, and the circle continues. So how do we break that cycle? One of the ways is to drive down the numbers. So I think it's been mentioned before, members and highways are quite resistant to reducing car parking. Now, to be honest, they are open-minded, more open-minded than we might think, but they need to see the sustainable transport, they need to see the evidence base, they need to see the vision which is more holistic and explains the issue with parking. We need to tailor to local ownership levels. Quite a lot of local authorities just have standards which don't respond to context, whether it's a city centre or a rural area, they don't respond to that. And we all know that there's a big difference in car ownership in those sorts of locations. Now, the table that you're seeing below is from East Sussex, which actually has a parking calculator, which I know is becoming more popular in quite a lot of local authorities, and that takes the guesswork out of calculating the parking need to a large degree. I mean, it's not foolproof, but it's a lot better than just standardised parking ratios. I think also taking away the separating out the cost of parking. I think when people need to pay for something, they're a bit more reluctant to maybe own a car. Sharing unallocated spaces. I mean, one of the big problems is we quite often catering for the worst case, but even then, it's the people with the 3 and the 4 cars who they're the ones whose cars are ending up on the street or causing antisocial issues. So unallocating can better cater for average car ownership, and I think that's the key. I mean, obviously mixed-use car clubs can all contribute, making sure that spaces are used. If the top right image, whether that vehicle can get into that garage, I'm not so sure. So if it can't be provided there, it needs to be provided somewhere else. Bay size, that's another key issue for some local authorities. It's often quoted that cars have got bigger, but the same people who tend to mention that, they don't realise that the spaces have also got bigger over time. So the top right image is probably quite typical for older car parking spaces, 2.2 by 4.4. The newer parking spaces, you're getting something along the lines of 2.5 by 5. And that makes a huge difference. So in the example that you see on the right, is it increases the amount of space that you've got to open the door by 60%. But the other factor to take into account is context. If you've got walls on either side, I think width is the key, length's not so much, but width is key. If you've got walls on either side, it's completely different to an open car park where you've got the gaps between the cars. So for example, I know one local authority has a standard of 5.5 meters by 2.9 meters wide. And that's designed to take into account all context, but what it means is that your car park with rows of car parking, it ends up with 20%, a 20% bigger car park. So I'm just going to take you through some of the typologies which Bob and so on have also referred to. So side parking, it gets the cars off the street, which is a good thing. Developers love it because it ends up with detached housing. They probably like it a bit too much in suburban areas. It tends to end up with narrow buildings because of the parking to the side and because of rear amenity standards. So when you've done the calculation, the width and the depth, developers don't like to create surplus space of gardens. You know, if it's 100 square meters, they'll be quite happy to make it exactly 100 square meters. They don't want to provide 200 square meters. So if you've already got a privacy distance and then you're widening the plots, that's when they don't like it. So they go for the narrow buildings. Quite often with side parking, it tends to lack urban characterization because you haven't got the continuity of frontage to frame and shape and enclose the space. You also tend not to have the landscape characterization. Lots of crossovers means less landscaping. Developers don't tend to like deep gardens, deep front gardens. The top right image, by the way, is actually a remodeling of it was actually a terrace street in Salford, and they took out every other house, which you can see it's they've reduced the density. It hasn't made it any less urban, and it's probably detrimental to the street scene in many ways. Though to be fair, it has increased the parking. Though it has reduced the on-street parking, I might add. So it's got quite an inefficient use of space. Obviously, it's there's nothing above there. Tandem spaces, the second space can often be underused. Tends to clutter and deaden the street scene, and you've got those crossover conflicts. So you know, people reversing out over footpaths. If there's a verge, then obviously it's got gaps in it. So what are the solutions to side parking? Well, we can bridge over the carports. So you can see the example on the top right. It's got a few of these examples actually. So bridging over the space, you can enclose it a bit more in just a single, without building over it. You can have a carport with doors, doors and gates. Though I think there's care attached to that, because obviously if it's a door which is difficult to open, if you have to get out of your car and open the thing, then it's less likely to be used. But so that's where maybe things like automation or fixed open gates are useful, and increasing landscaping to create that landscape characterization if it's lacking a bit of the urban character. And the next typology is front of plot parking. So it is the dream in isolation of other issues, though you know, it does lead to quite a few problems at the same time. So the car and driveway dominated street scene, the top image on the right is from the Essex Design Guide, which is probably the best rationale for not doing that type of parking. You've got scant space for greenery. You tend to end up with vacuous street proportions. Obviously, it's set back behind the parking. It's not very intimate. Again, you've got the crossover conflict. So the bottom right image is one where I master planned it when I was in private practice. I must admit, I didn't have in mind how it turned out. I think the architecture is fine, but the parking solution isn't very good, if I'm being honest. So what are the solutions to front of plot parking? Well, you can wrap it in landscaping, which I think Bob referred to earlier. So it's more landscape characterized. You can set back to the prevailing frontage. So you can see the car on the right. It's actually an L-shaped building, I think. So it's set between the buildings, but it is actually in front of the building at the same time. I think it tends to only work for low densities or occasionally. I wouldn't recommend it, generally speaking. So on-street parallel parking, I think Bob's also referred to similar examples as the one on the right. So it's convenient, it's well used, it's got continuity of active frontage, it's land efficient, but it does reduce values. Commercially, developers are a bit skeptical, especially in certain areas. Highways don't encourage it, which is key, I think. It can lead to ad hoc antisocial parking, and there's also the electric charging issue. So in terms of solutions, the bottom right image is Goldsmith Street, which is the RIBA Sterling Prize Award winner. It's based on it's based on an area which includes the street in the top right image. So it's quite a simple solution. I must admit, it's a bit strange why it's not used more often. You know, getting back to our roots of on-street parking, it's unallocated, so it caters for the average car ownership. It's adding value in terms of place and density. I think the key is to design in social parking. We've got to design out that antisocial parking. Some of that comes down to road widths. It's in terms of electric charging, there's obviously emerging technologies on the bottom left-hand image you can see there. It is still a challenge. So there's another option on that coming up later. I think it's also, I say low, it's suitable where there's low car ownership, but by low, I think the Goldsmith Street provides one parking space per unit, and with average car ownerships generally being around that, possibly under, possibly over, you know, that could, it can still be useful for a lot of places. On-street 90-degree parking. It's also liked by developers. You often spot it. It's good. It's an easy way to normally spot the affordable housing that commercial developers provide. So it's the 30 or 40%, because it's an easy way to squeeze in the maximum amount of properties. But everything gets squeezed, apart from the spatial dimensions, which become quite vacuous again. And for pedestrians, quite often you're forced to walk around the 90-degree parking. So what are the solutions? So I think it's mainly a case of designing them as places, not just parking areas. So designing them as building enclosed parking square, designing them as tree-lined avenues, such as the bottom right, that's Horsted Place. It's making sure that there's reasonable space between the windows and cars, so they're not squashed in. And still though, I would suggest it's only in moderation only. It's quite difficult to do it successfully in terms of the street scene and street life.
We have a 1 minute warning there, Paul.
Yeah. Last one is rear parking. So for those who don't know, its origins lie in the Radburn concept, which was a 1930s American concept. It was about vehicle separation to protect the safe community living. It had two frontages, so it had a front to the pedestrianised network and a secondary front, which was the service road, which provided the parking. How that translated into the UK was slightly different in the 1950s to 70s. So the key distinction was it created a back normally onto the parking. Unfortunately, Radburn, it became increasingly discredited as a concept, as there was lots of different variants which went away from the original concept. Though the parking court, the rear parking court, was resurrected. It's one of Radburn's legacies. I mean, just to prove it can, you know, you've probably associated with that the Holborn Radburn 1960s estates, but it can look attractive. This is a pre-Letchworth Garden City development converted to a Radburn estate, and it works very, very well. So a quick analysis. Well, I suppose you probably know the parking issues to do with rear parking. So I'll move on to the solutions because I know time is short. Maximise the pedestrianisation and frontage. That's what rear parking can do, but probably no other parking can, mainstream parking can. Design as attractive courts and lanes, not design them as spaces again. Self-policing, get the tracking done early on so that you know that you can actually deliver the rear parking. I've just used the Accordia example because in many ways it is actually a Radburn design. It's got a dual frontage, a service road and a green lane on the other side, a pedestrianised green lane. Poundbury is completely based on rear courtyard parking. You can't deliver Poundbury without rear courtyard parking. I know some people aren't fans of rear courtyard parking, but it's got its uses. Continuity of frontage is the main one in terms of Poundbury. This is another example. This is Fairfield Park in Letchworth. I think what it really shows is the benefits of pedestrianisation through rear parking. So the top right image, the dark green are the lines are the fully pedestrianised routes, the cycle friendly, pedestrian friendly. It's that filtered permeability. It's focused on the neighbourhood centre. The light green is the edges, the pedestrianised edges of open space. So you can see the left-hand example, the top left-hand example where people can spill out from the home straight into the space. It's very child-friendly, this place. So key lessons, I'll leave that on the screen, and yeah, we'll come back to that, I'm sure.
Thanks very much, Paul. It was a great run through, and I'll just let everyone take those key lessons in, and then invite John Little up next to talk around some parking reduction strategies from his experiences. John, over to you.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, is that working?
Looking good.
Cool. So yeah, hello, I'm John Little. I have a little practice called Bespoke Transport Consulting, and I'm a kind of one of those highway engineers, or at least masquerading as one. Actually, an environmental scientist by education, specialised in transport. Ended up heading up parking sustainable transport, which isn't quite as daft as it sounds. With parking control being the most powerful sustainable transport tool there is. I'm going to try and run through just this evening some ideas around parking reduction, the need for parking, you know, whether it needs to be there at all. Lean on Waltham Forest Mini Holland a little bit, but also show you some other examples of where parking reduction strategies can begin to chip away at things and maybe change places. You know, I mean, needless to say, businesses certainly always think that parking is vital for their existence. Just in Leven's human area I was working in a year or so ago, and some way to actually have a wander around the area, I saw this. And of course, Nadine supermarket there thinks car parking's vitally important. Footway's closed just past there, the 20-mile-an-hour sign's been hit, but the car park is available. And in the road next door, not everyone agrees. Conflicting message from obviously people who aren't quite so happy that so many people parking in their streets. And just say, I mean, Chris and other people have touched on it already, but of course there are citywide programmes in places around the world trying to chip away at parking and repurpose space. Not necessarily the case in London, primarily because the borough system, or the two-tiered system as such, and while strategies certainly lean towards it, it isn't always the case that all boroughs kind of head in that direction. This is Lambeth, somewhere I worked a few years ago, and this is a resident-led sort of design scheme about reallocating road space primarily. And quite interestingly, this is a school keep clear where all the parents used to park on, ignore the rules. Kids terrified, guardrail up, parents scared of kids being run over, etc., etc. Best thing we could do is build it out, make it impossible. Effectively, parents couldn't park anywhere without annoying all the other parents who began a school, and therefore having a bit of a scrap. So it doesn't happen anymore. Kids grow plants and hang out. Waltham Forest Mini Holland, I'm going to skip through these very quickly, and I won't read all that, but needless to say, the whole programme was based around reallocating road space, and parking, absolutely vital part of that. And that's not to say, of course, that providing parking in the right places wasn't vital as well. But lots of the main roads, that's Lee Bridge Road, before things happened, may have had bus lane down them, for example, there, but that operated 6 hours a day. And the rest of the time it was effectively on one long parking bay. And if you were brave enough to cycle with your kid to nursery like that dad there, you kind of had to go down the Death Star running between there and hope you presumably ended up at nursery at the other end. Oh. And again, just to show that's outside the mosque, the amount of space dedicated to parking on Lee Bridge Road when we started, prior to the Mini Holland bid being successful, and fundamentally proposing that and a change to a more, you know, you could say civil street design, certainly probably fairer, actually space for people who did cycle. Cycling was pretty popular along there. It had grown about 42% in the year prior to the money being given to the borough anyway. And lots of people were cycling despite the conditions, not because of them, of course. And similarly in the villages, this is the low traffic neighbourhoods, the villages, they were known in the Mini Holland programme. This is kind of actually one of the slides we showed in the early exhibitions, and this is kind of the top. There's Urbanism Road as it was, and there was this kind of random Dutch street that I had a photo of. I think that we were showing where we're kind of going, and the obvious things that are missing in those photos. The photo at the bottom, of course, are the parked cars. It's not to say with the spa and everything else that's in Urbanism Road, of course, people don't want to go there, and you can see the bus in the photo at the top, of course, as well, which is vital for people who need access to Urbanism Road, and of course people with mobility issues and the like are part of that in a massive way as well. But as it was, wasn't good for anybody, I think it's fair to say. And whilst, of course, businesses were used to working in the way they were, and of course, change is change, it doesn't look the most inviting of places. And again, people went there kind of despite those conditions. So the process we tried to go through was that effect. It looks very complicated, but the idea was a continuous conversation. It was about actually getting the data and information into the process to have a conversation with people about that change, which we knew was going to be difficult. The demonstrations I'm sure you may have heard about. At the same time, we were going out on Leavage Road and talking to people through a perception survey, asking what they thought, asking businesses what they thought, and also their customers, which meant when we went to engage them on the scheme, which was obviously trying to put that template down on the ground, we were informed by data, we were informed by opinion, views, of course, some conflicting, some hated what we were up to, and still do. But what we could also do, because we'd spoken to businesses, was provide parking in the side roads and where it was needed in order to transfer that space we wanted on the corridor to provide for movement and place, as you can see in the green spaces and tree planting that's been added or was proposed to be added. Vitally important that you go through that process with businesses. So whole pages dedicated in the consultation document to parking and what was being provided and where and how it would work and all that stuff. And also about why the space was being modified. Even more important to that was to explain to businesses that sometimes they haven't got this right. And I've, having worked on God knows how many tens of controlled parking zones and various other things in my past, businesses always overestimate the amount of people that drive to their shops, primarily because people moan about not being able to find a parking space. People never say, all right, morning, Dave, had a lovely walk here again, as I did every day, as I do every day, as I do because I live around the corner. They hear that feedback loop of negative feedback from people who, of course, are never going to have enough parking spaces in front of a corner shop for more than one or two people to turn up at any one time anyway. And as you can see in the top left there, that's what businesses think people wanted from Leavage Road, and that's what people wanted from Leavage Road. And let's not forget that businessmen and businesswomen are business people. The idea they're in it to make money, surely. So, and customers are customers. It doesn't matter if they get on a magic carpet. And talking of red carpets, of course, when you get it right, you can provide. And again, people are talking about disabled access for people on Leavage Road. And of course, there's destinations that people want to go to. And that's it was a real concern of our design process, primarily because we wanted to get the scheme on the ground and it be a street for everyone. And there's no better indication, if you ask me, than a guy in a mobility scooter who probably would be the sort of person who are people worried about accessing that place and normally point at the cycle track as being the issue that will prevent them going to head into the mosque on their own or parking or whatever it might be, and there he is using it in front of me in my cargo bike. And there we go. That's, as good as you can get, I think, with us transferring a visualization into real life. Parking is controlled, of course. In this instance, we're in an urban environment, and to me, that provides massive benefits because you can start chipping away at that and manage it and modify it and provide 4-hour bays for hairdressers and 30-minute bays for shops. And when you start doing that, you can take away the spaces and create those meanwhile sort of spaces and meeting places. Again, this is a modal filter. This is to prevent traffic movement into a residential area, but it's also a garden. It's a place. It's a space that didn't exist before. And it's a barrier and it's a gateway, and you come off Leavage Road and you're into the residential neighbourhood. It's a decision point and it's a message. And again, obviously that's the end of that street has been turned into a one-way working. That parking bay that you can see on the raised section of footway there is 2 disabled bays together for the Samaritans and another destination there, which are again well used by disabled visitors. So there is the parking there at the end of the street for the people who need it. The rest of the people who may want to park have unrestricted have parking bays further in, and provided they have a relevant permit, of course, they can park within their area. But the idea, of course, is that we manage the parking demand, and we do that by providing an alternative for short trips and cycling, walking, which enables different uses. In the villages, no different. And again, as you can see, the demand for space in the urban environment is insane. That's the guys during the trial of the village in 2014 putting the AstroTurf parklets down, and the kids are down on them before we even bolted the benches on there. And let's not remind ourselves where they were, what that street looked like only a couple of weeks before, because there it is on the left and there it is on the right. And again, we can talk about access. We can talk about the fact that, of course, people can't be driven right up to the spa in the way they can or could previously, but there are disabled bays just at the top of that photo. As you can see, there are loading bays just behind me where I took the photo. There are car club bays, and there are, of course, plentiful cycle parking and seating and all that other access for people. Another local, well, actually a B road, and the first B road to be filtered, we think, in the country, near me in Leighton, Francis Road. Again, as you can see, very traditional Victorian high street, and traditional as in Plonkton parking into a Victorian traditional street layout. That's not how it used to look. And if anything, we've probably reverted it back to more how it used to look, albeit with some Dutch brick and things that might not have been there pre-mass car ownership. And some other things that are part of the programme that people wouldn't necessarily think of as being parking reduction strategies, that includes providing alternatives for the school run. People, those link trips that we know particularly mothers end up sort of chained to because they're going to work after taking the kids and maybe going to shops or doing whatever. A cargo bike can perform all those tasks for them. I mean, that's the way my family get around. Again, I can admit I'm in an urban environment, and I'm blessed to be able to do that to a certain extent. However, it proves it can be done, and we have proven with hundreds and hundreds of hires with people that they can do the school run in a cargo bike, and businesses can use them too. And there's an example of a trial we ran over Christmas, delivering Christmas presents, a precursor to a zero emission delivery service. The bottom there is bottom left is a bit of subliminal brainwashing for people to remind them that 1 in 5 cars in Waltham Forest when we started in the morning was on the way to school, and if they were put front to end, they'd stretch all the way from Walthamstow to Wembley Stadium. The cycle hanger at the bottom there, again, it's sort of contentious part of the programme, and actually when we put the first 10 in, people sort of sniggering and saying how ridiculous and outrageous it was that we're taking half a car parking space to give 6 people spaces to put their bikes. There's now 500 of those in the borough, and there's the 100th being opened by Councillor Lokes and various other members of the team, and some residents who are absolutely buzzing that it's in their street, and not most importantly, the lady at the front there who lived, these are Warner houses. Again, I'm sure some of you guys know what that means. 2 front doors, upstairs, downstairs flats, and she lived upstairs, so bike ownership was almost impossible for her, given her mobility issues. In fact, she couldn't carry a bike up her stairs herself. She sees it as a mobility aid, and of course having it in the hanger there on the street is perfect for her. Another big fan of another thing that I'm a big fan of, and again, it's not the utopia for people who are, let's ban all cars effectively, but I think we have to be realistic, of course, and again, particularly as we move outside of urban areas. And the car club is an amazing tool for me. I've been involved in car clubs for years, going back to mid-2000s, but 200 car club cars in Islington over a couple of years. And what we actually noticed was, just as they suggest, that people did defer purchase of cars and get rid of cars. And we worked out in Islington that through those 200 cars, we'd probably freed up about 7.5 Wembley pitches worth of space on the street. And of course, they'd filled back up with new people coming in and newer cars, and the increase in density in places like Islington, I'm sure in CPZ, in Angel and the place, more cars have filled that space. But if it could have been controlled, and I actually started and didn't finish a pilot project in Islington in the mid-2000s called the low car neighbourhood, not to be confused with the low traffic neighbourhood. But the idea being that with parking controls and actually preventing people coming in with new vehicles, you could, as you chipped away and got people to invest into car clubs and actually got rid of the car that sat in their parking space outside their house, think about what you could do with that space instead. And I know Brenda Peach on listening in, and of course her thoughts around parklets and the like are exactly that. And what I kind of proved was that actually, if you work with people, I think on an area-wide basis, and join those car parking spaces together and thought about the little space you can make in urban areas, people would embrace it and do it. Again, the commitment to car club ownership, if more cars come into your street, doesn't actually transform your street. It just, of course, transforms your life and means that you walk and cycle more. Another quick example is similar vein, and is street van as it was then, now Zip Van. I'm sure, again, many of you may have used that. There's a youthful looking me, or slow, I don't know if it was youthful looking me at the back, certainly scruffy, or scruffier. And that was the first van we launched in Islington into, again, mid-2000s, aimed at reducing the amount of businesses who drove to Angel and parked their car in parking spaces they said they desperately needed for their customers. So I ended up with about 14 businesses on Essex Road sharing that van. A bit of a eureka moment, a penny drop moment, I think, for guys at Zip Van, because they realised there was another market for their vans, and there's now 500 of those dotted around the streets of London, performing similar purposes. And of course, every one of those that goes in means that businesses and other people don't own vehicles that clog up spaces on street. And I suppose just to get to the sort of very mature version of that, I went back to Orford Road the other day to get some photos of something else I was doing with with Chris, and actually again some of the Bristol guys I see on the chat, so maybe they've seen some of these photos. But there's Zed, so that's the Christmas Courier now as a fully fledged business in Waltham Forest, a zero emission delivery service, delivering stuff to the Spa and Orford Road, where, of course, when we went through the trials and tribulations in 2014, the world was going to stop with regards to the ability to deliver right outside the doors of those businesses. Also, some of those businesses probably rightfully thought, but it just kind of shows that if you go with them and give them the alternatives and provide, the support is there, and of course there's something to buy into, that change can happen. Thank you.
Nice one, John. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Good summary. I'm conscious we need to get onto the chat, but I also wanted to quickly bring in Michael Rogers from Bristol, just because he put something interesting in the chat around the Bristol City Council perspective. And Michael, are you available to give us a 2-minute run through what you were thinking about?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks for the opportunity, really. So much to say on this subject, really, as I think you kicked off, or somebody said early on, with parking and access generally is such a massive issue for anyone who's sort of involved with placemaking and urban design, really. Yet it's sort of picking up on probably more on, I think, what Bob White was talking about earlier. A lot of what I'm involved with and my colleagues at the moment is related to suburban developments where the city council is disposing of land through our housing delivery programme. So we're in quite a fortunate position. We're not just reliant on, say, the planning process, development management, Section 38, that sort of thing. So it does put us in quite an advantageous position to be experimenting a bit, but we are increasingly, in order to balance everything we're trying to get on these suburban sites, we're trying to achieve minimum 50 net dwellings per hectare density, and we've increasingly got expectations around green infrastructure, biodiversity net gain, SUDS provision on site, etc. Sorry, my daughter's knocking at the window while I'm speaking to you, trying to get in. And obviously, satisfying transport infrastructure and parking requirements as well. So we're recognising increasingly that key to that is actually how we design parking in and trying to optimise how much we actually design into the street and the public realm. From the outset. I mean, you can't do that in all instances. You'll always need a mix and a balance, but we're trying to optimize rather than maximize what we get in the public realm. So we are having some joy with our highway engineers in that regard. I mean, there was a reluctance to start with, even to count anything that's on street. I think they recognise now that if we can do this, you get density right, you start to benefit, as somebody's already touched on, walkability, public transport viability, etc. So it's as much about transport as it is about placemaking. And yeah, so even really just to say, I think the solutions come down to we haven't resolved all the issues yet. One of the big issues is commercially, obviously, there's still quite a big requirement and desire to have degrees of allocated parking in there, and we're trying to find ways around that. And to be fair, it helps to say that it's our land that we're working with, but we are finding developers being more open-minded about setting up, say, like a parking permit area rather than having specifically allocated. And with our own sites that we're developing for the city council's own housing stock, we are just going for completely unallocated, which obviously is by far the most efficient way of using land, as in itself a scarce resource, really. So things like sustainable drainage as well. So again, it's that sort of balancing everything to try and increase the multifunctionality of everything, the built form, the transport infrastructure and the green infrastructure. So the more we can design the SUDS into the adoptable highway, or even to management company, possibly managed and owned parking bays, the better. We don't have to provide that space elsewhere on the site. So yeah, I'd say don't lose faith, really, and work. Highway engineers, I think they do need to be convinced that these solutions are going to work, but they've got legitimate reasons for those reservations. But I've noticed Graham Smith was in the room earlier. I'm assuming this is Oxford Brookes Graham Smith, who's taught me all this when I did the course many years ago. But he was one who said, optimize what you do in the public realm. Challenge in that regard. But you say that issues that are coming up are things like, for instance, permeable paving. We've had a reluctance to adopt permeable paving. Part of that is again very legitimate because we've had a highway asset manager who's had his budget completely decimated, and he's rightly concerned about the cost. So, again, to get to an efficient spatial planning solution, you need to think way beyond just what you're drawing. You need to be thinking creatively about how you manage, how you own, how you're going to overcome issues like that. And I mean, it's sorry, I'm giving you a bit of diatribe here, but I think that's the way forward, certainly in suburban locations, is just to think more creatively about street designs.
Thanks, Michael. A really good run through. Graham is saying hello, and Helen is asking for some layout, so I'll let you respond on the chat there. I think it'd be nice to get into a bit of conversation. I wonder if I can kick it off from a chat that from a question that I've pulled up a chat earlier. Maybe one for John. The question was from Lee Heacoop, so please do come in if I have misrepresented your question, but it seems pretty clear. And it was sort of asking around what tools can we use to win over hearts and minds of communities about removing side street parking. You feel like you must have come across that a lot in your work in Waltham Forest.
Yeah, I mean, well, sort of generally, really. I mean, I think as I alluded to, most people are in business to make money. It's not that they will let their business crumble, provided people can still park outside. And it's difficult everywhere I've ever done it and gone on that process, and be it for a controlled parking zone or a curb to curb reconstruction or whatever it is. You need that data and you need that information. And so first of all, you need the actual parking surveys and the beat stuff that show you what's going on. Then you probably need to ask people what they think. You need to engage with the businesses, ask them what they think, and then actually have that sort of circular conversation and try and explain to people back what other people actually think. Because as I said in the presentation, sort of without being too harsh on retail business, certainly small businesses tend to, I think, misunderstand how much they rely on car parking, and probably to the detriment of their businesses quite often, rather sadly. So yeah, it's sort of knowledge is power and should be shared. And again, places shouldn't be afraid to say that they know stuff. I think local authorities, again, with data and information, parking surveys, not the most glamorous and sexy things to ever look through if you've ever had the misfortune. But of course, the information you can get out of them is vital. I hope, did that answer it? I don't know.
That's great. Thank you very much. Yes. Your presentation actually has quite a lot of that material in, but I do realise I have a
yeah, I mean, it's a lot of effort. One of my former colleagues is actually on her as well, Amy, and she will know. When it came to speaking to people cycling, Amy was out there at 6 o'clock in the morning with me in the rain, in the darkness, under a gazebo, grabbing cyclists and getting them to tell us what they thought of the street. When it came to the businesses, we went to all 400 and something odd within the consultation area 3 times. We went door to door with an iPad with the survey on it so they could fill it in at the desk and not give them something to fill in, which they wouldn't. And then they'd go on the front page of the paper saying, no one came to see me, right, despite the fact you had.
That's a big tip. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Has anybody else got any questions for our panelist? Open us up into more of a conversation, or any of the other speakers want to come in on that point. Just wave at me, turn your camera on and wave. Amanda.
Hi, I just wanted to say more power to John for getting all that research done, because we know this through social media these days. Data is king, and we can't fight for any of these activities without data. I think I made a statement in my presentation about all the research about who visits retail demonstrates that that those who drive cars are far lower than the retailers expect. And somebody put a question and say, where is that research? Well, actually, it's everywhere. I mean, I think every council, I'm sure John would be able to identify that with the Waltham Forest examples. And but the trouble is there isn't a big research study that's been done on where does retailers, customers come from. It tends to be focused with respect to a specific place when you're proposing to do something like Waltham Forest done with the Mini Hollands, and others have done with other Mini Hollands. But it's probably, you can probably even see it at the moment in your high street with all the COVID issues and the way the pavements have been widened, etc. Suddenly there's a whole lot more people going to the places where they can hang around outside on the street. The pubs, for instance, that have nowhere to sit outside are just closed still until next Monday. So there are visual things like that, but I've never ever read a survey that said actually when they took the parking away, fewer people went to that particular shop. There may be some somewhere, but I think that's quite an interesting one. But yeah, data, research.
I agree. And then of course there is, you know, the slightly complex issue as well of roads like Leabridge Road, you know, those sort of high roads, particularly on the periphery of cities, I from experience tend to find, you know, quite specialist shops are located there. And it's a bit of a historical thing. And of course, again, you know, with specialist shops sometimes comes people traveling long distance to go to them. But of course, the advent of internet shopping and the like has kind of moved the goalposts, certainly, with that. And I think, again, places having sort of premises with retail frontage on high roads and it's kind of an unnecessary overhead for their business themselves. And I think if you took a step back, they probably aren't located in the right place if they're going to carry on doing that kind of stuff, because, you know, it's mail order and that kind of retail where that's headed. Again, it's a very difficult one because the last.
In fact, John, what you often discover is people that are destinations like that, if somebody's driven a long way to get to that place, they are prepared to park 100 meters away. They will search, they're quite happy to search for a car park, walk there, because it is something specific. They don't necessarily expect to park outside. It's often the local person who's driven half a kilometer or is stopping on their way home or something like that, and thinks, if I can just stop outside the spa or whatever, pop in and get 2 packets of something and come back out. And so we do have to reprogram our brains to think, well, I can't actually do that anymore. And in fact, I'm not driving to work anyway, so I will shop and move and work in a different way.
Absolutely. And I've got a wave from Graham, and I've got a hands from Dave and Mark. So Graham first.
Hello, Chris. One of the things that I have noticed lots in the Netherlands, since I used to spend a lot of my life looking at car parking in the Netherlands, is in higher density developments, is to have road centre parking, road centre unallocated. And certainly that was one of the things that I mentioned when I was talking about PPG 3 100 years ago with the parking limitation, that if you have convenient unallocated parking, you can, well, as Phil Jones's studies have done as well, you can have 30, 40, 50% extra effective parking ratio. And I guess it gets turned off as an idea many times because it seems to be patently inefficient. And yes, I think the measurements, if you look at 30 dwellings a hectare, 40, 50 dwellings a hectare development in the Netherlands, you can find, it seems to me that it's an ideal solution. End of.
Yeah.
I'll put a couple of links in the chat.
Yeah, I saw those. Thanks for that. I'll make sure everyone gets them. Dave Holiday, you had your hand up, and then Mark, you were next.
Am I okay there? Sometimes my sound's a bit wobbly. Picking up on Amanda's, there is a lot of stuff. There was a fine report being on city transport use by the European Commission Director 13 in 1999, reflecting on some studies done various cities. The one that really stuck was one on supermarket shopping. And the people who came shopping by car, only 25% of them bought more than 2 full bags of shopping. And it was judged that a pedestrian would walk away with two bags of shopping normally. Something in the region of 70% of the people who arrived by bike took more than 2 bags of shopping. And you know, it's how we relate and use the environment. We also have in Scotland 4 city LEZs approaching. They've been put back from December 2022 to December 2023. But from those dates, if you want to enter a city LEZ, you'll have to pay a £60 fine if you've got a non-compliant vehicle with ANPR enforcement. To help with this, they're offering a scrappage scheme where you can get up to £3,000 if you scrap an old car. But you can't spend all of it on putting it towards the cost of a new car, which the only people who can afford a new electric car anyway are people who are well off. So it's very much tempting people to buy a bus pass and join a car club and hire bikes. So there's a lot to be had there. I posted a little bit as well. Donald Shout started this off that the average car sits parked for 95% of the time. And work by ITS, Greg Marsden in Leeds, noted that if we actually got people to switch from owning cars to using car clubs, we could potentially reduce the number of cars that need to be parked by 90%. We could reduce the number of charging points we need by 90%, and we could reduce the land we need to, or the electric cars we need to provide by 90%. So the sort of conversion rate is a winner. That's the sort of thing to take on board. And I also got interesting material on households. When the tram or the bus route arrives, they look at their car, get rid of it, pocket a few grand for that, and then they're saving about £3 grand a year on their travel costs.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, good points. Any links you want to put in the chat, please do. Mark, your hand was next, and then we're gonna finish with a question to everyone. Hi, thanks so much. My question is concerning how to solve hospital parking. For example, in Bristol, we have a big hospital in the centre, and they want to actually put up a multi-storey car park, but they're not getting permission for it. But is there any creative solutions specifically around that sort of thing, where you have a big hospital or big complex where you get a lot of people coming on a daily basis? Thanks. That's a good question.
Better public transport.
Free public transport.
Better public transport and special things to the hospital.
Staff. No. The hospital a large hospital generates between 30 and 50,000 trips a day. If you build it appropriately, like the Borders Hospital, it was designed so that all the bus routes would run through the hospital instead of having to go down a cul-de-sac and cost them each about 8 to 15 minutes to visit the hospital. As a result, all the bus companies run via the hospital main entrance, and everybody sits in the cafe waiting for their bus. The bus shelter is actually used as a smoking shelter. There are stations in Glasgow. The one that springs to mind is Hindland. There's no proper station building, yet it is the 340th busiest station in the UK, with nearly 1.8 million passengers a year on the count, pre-COVID. The reason is that it's only 500 metres from the hospital, and 50% of the Glasgow area locations have got direct trains to Hindland. So it's very much making your hospital fit that way, and going to the bus operator, as Southampton did with their Unilink buses, and saying, if we sell 3,000 student bus passes, or if our staff are using 3,000 bus passes, will you actually put on a bus service that fits our needs?
Yeah, thanks for that, Dave. I think choice is the clear answer in terms of how we can get rid of parking and around that.
I've worked on 2 hospital car parking strategies, and in both instances, about 2/3 of the parking demand are staff, not patients. But
yeah, I can believe it. We're a little bit over time, but it was a good question came in the chat earlier, which I wanted to put to the panelists and indeed anyone in the chat. But the question was, how can we limit the parking permit availability in developments if, as a developer, you want to offer fewer than the local authority quota? Anyone got any pearls of wisdom on that one? John, have you worked on any developments when you're trying to offer fewer permits? How can we limit parking permit availability in your work? Neil might want to come in.
I mean, well, I was going to lean back on the car club thing again. In Islington years ago, we did a thing during the credit crunch, or what was it called, the mid 2000s crash, and we called it car crunch, and it was basically telling people how much they spent on a car sitting there, like not moving 95% of the time, as Dave said, and depreciating all the rest of it. And if they gave up their car, they got basically parking permits worth of active travel vouchers to use at a bike shop or with streetcar or whatever it might have been at the time. And I appreciate, again, of course, with parking standards and the like, it's difficult for you guys because you have to provide minimums in some instances. But I think you know, with some flexibility, certainly some planning developments I've been involved in, you know, the car club option can be used to reduce that need. And of course, I think if you spoke to people about alternative use of space, in some instances, people might be willing to work with you if you're providing above the minimum, for example, to households.
Thanks, John. Neil, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I mean, I think as we move from a sort of predominantly owner-occupier speculative sale model, which I think is an inevitable change at the moment in the market towards more rental property, becomes a bit easier. I mean, the whole planning system is almost set up around the whole house builder idea that your involvement in a house or a place ends when you sell, and so the idea that things that are perfectly legally possible, that people could be obliged to be responsible for things, you know, after they finish building it, you know, sort of planning authorities, highways authorities don't like the idea of relying on management strategies. I mean, we've got a scheme in for planning at the moment, town centre regeneration scheme in one of the Victorian towns in Milton Keynes, where we're proposing a sort of, actually for the standard, for the actual level of parking for rental units is quite a high level of parking, but it's miles below adopted standards. And you know, part of what we're saying is, you know, this will be a managed scheme, and you know, if it's a 3 or 4 bed home, it'll be 1 space per dwelling. If it's less than that, it'll be none or 1. But overall, it's about 0.8. But it's really nearest train station and turn up and go bus services and stuff. So all the sorts of sustainable movement things are ticked, and we're sort of saying, look, you can make it, and this happens all over in London and elsewhere. You can make it a matter of a breach of a tenancy agreement or a leasehold agreement if people store cars on the public highway, or own more cars in the vicinity of the site than they've got, you know, than they've got labelled in their tenancy agreement. You don't even need a permit scheme. It's perfectly possible to do, and what you use is the fact that most people don't want to be evicted from their home. Trying to sort of introduce that element of behavioural and managerial thinking into a debate with the Highways Authority is an utter nightmare. But we have to be able to do it if we're going to be able to move to a situation where, you know, as most of the public finance things are pointing us to, developers and property managers, rather than highways authorities and local authorities, take responsibility for the behaviour of their tenants and occupiers. And I think, you know, there's a new generation of developers who are perfectly happy to do that, because in the end, you know, the cost of a parking space in terms of development foregone or amenity space foregone is absolutely astronomical. It's far more in most developments than the value you get from providing people with a second or a third parking space or a sort of convenient visitor space. So, I mean, I think the whole thing is just this kind of weird through the looking glass debate where we're not actually realizing what kind of creates value in this stuff. And as I say, I think that part of the challenge we've got is that the whole system is set up as this like complex between house builder layout technicians and highways authorities people who just sort of, you know, think that the only way to do it is to provide what people want for free. And I just don't believe that that's the case. Sorry, I'm on my soapbox, but you get the idea.
No, I think it's a good point, well made. I think it's that idea about creating the conditions where people actually want to be, and that's where values are made. If there's no more questions, I'm minded just to call this switch out to an end, as we're over time. And just leaves me to thank all of our great speakers, Amanda, Bob, Paul, and John. Thank you very much.